Hi everyone, this is really exciting. This is a TV studio, so I've never done this before. I really enjoyed the first few speakers talking about the Toronto tech community because my company, one of the things that we always talk about when we talk to American companies is that they're much better off dealing with Toronto to build their software because there's a lot of great developers in Toronto. There's a ton of amazing schools, and if you try to hire developers in Cambridge or in Silicon Valley, good luck. Someone I used to work for, I won't name them, but they're in a very hot startup in Cambridge, and they're paying $30,000 referral fees for developers. Now imagine you have to compete with them to build a team, whereas in Toronto you can really put together an amazing team and build amazing software. So I think that we'll see lots more startups actually coming to Toronto in the future. So I'm talking about Angular fundamentals for rapid HTML5 application development. And I run the AngularJS meetup in Toronto. We've been around for 4 months. We're going to be having our 4th meetup next Wednesday. And we have almost 550 people in the group. Our very first meetup, which was 4 weeks after founding the group, we had 200 people show up. I think that was like massive, 200 people live watching the meetup. Matthew was kind enough to stream our 3rd meetup. And it's a great statistic. We had 43,000 views on Justin TV, thanks to Matthew getting us on the front page. Probably 42,700 were there for a second and a half before they realized they were lost because it was a very technical event. But it was really awesome. And it was 300 concurrent people, 100 people there, and probably another 600 people have watched the talk since then. And so the interest in AngularJS is just incredible. And it's extremely well deserved. Because this is the HTML5 Toronto group, I'm going to talk about it from a slightly different angle and not so much a development angle, which I am, but really you can think of it as HTML5 applications. And HTML5 is really a revolutionary technology because it brings you fast JavaScript, it gives you compatible browsers, and it gives you a bunch of services that allow you to even run offline, even if in a web browser or in a mobile phone, and you can do responsive web applications, right? That's all based upon HTML5. And with that, it's an application platform in itself. And with it being so robust and being able to handle so much of the application load, you can move almost your entire application there. And we're going to talk about that. And so you can think of, if you're building HTML5 applications, you're putting more in the browser. If you're putting more in the browser, it needs a new approach, and that's Angular. And so this slide sort of covers that. The next generation web is inverted. You have that traditional server-side application where you've got to build massive server farms to scale, and you're rendering web pages and you're serving them out. That's moving to an API-centric web where most of the application is running in the browser, whether it's on a mobile tablet or in a browser, and the server's disappearing. It's an API, it's JSON, JavaScript object notation being sent back and forth. And that means you can use generic web database backends, and you can scale much faster, much easier, and you don't have to talk to the server as much. And so in terms of this, I like to just call this the hat stack. I just like making up acronyms, so bear with me. But HTML5 is the foundation. Anyone I talk to about Angular, I start talking about HTML5 and how revolutionary it is, and how that enables applications in the browser. And AngularJS is the best way for building those applications, which we'll go through. And that results in a thin server. And so this is a drastically different application architecture than from 5 years ago. And even 5 years ago, that was what maybe going back maybe 8 years ago, was the beginning of the Ajax revolution, where to create really good user experiences in the web, you started putting in more and more JavaScript. JavaScript was good enough, the document object model was flexible enough, the APIs were there, jQuery came out, and it was a tsunami rolling through the web development world. An astounding number of websites in the world use jQuery, and they do it for all kinds of stuff, animations, transitions, and it makes the applications much more interactive. But as you build bigger and bigger applications, it becomes very hard to use. It becomes very unwieldy, and a different approach is required. And that's where you get into a full application framework, such as AngularJS. And once you do that, the server starts disappearing. So in 2005, 50% of any web app was JavaScript in the browser, and it was all hacked in. and it was hacked in to give a good user experience. And what that resulted in was duplication of code, because you have to duplicate that same scenario that you've done on the server already in the browser. In 2013, with the emergence of better JavaScript libraries and a much higher demand for a user experience and responsive applications, 70% of your application is probably JavaScript. Even if you're using PHP, Ruby, Python, Java, you're getting to the point where if you're writing an excellent user experience, 70% of your code base is in JavaScript. And so why call it a Python app? Why call it a Ruby app? Why call it a PHP app? It's a JavaScript app with some other code on the back end. The last version of Basecamp, which is one of the more famous Ajax applications out there, and it was the start of the Rails application framework, came from it, was 5,000 lines of Ruby and 5,000 lines of CoffeeScript, 50-50. And that's a server-side application. They use some JavaScript in the browser, well, a lot, obviously, from the numbers there. CoffeeScript is a very concise version of JavaScript. It's about the same density as Ruby. And then the backend databases like Couch and MongoDB speak JavaScript. And so JavaScript is really taking over web applications. And because of this, if you're building a single page application, you remove more from the server, those big, heavy back-end applications become somewhat of a poor fit for most business cases. And so this is your traditional server-centric web application. And we're moving to a browser-centric HTML5 world, where the templating and the routing is moving up into the client. And what does that mean for the server? It's gone. And that's one of the mistakes a lot of people make when they start with AngularJS, is they do business as usual on the server, and then they start trying to use Angular to enhance the web page like they do with jQuery. Angular is not like that. Angular is a full web application framework. It is everything that you would do with PHP or Rails, well, mostly everything, and it's in the browser, and so you don't need that in the back end. And it uses RESTful APIs to talk to databases and backends. If you take a NoSQL database like MongoDB, your data query language disappears, because a lot of the backend in modern web development is really fighting SQL to get it into a format that your application can use. JSON is JavaScript object notation, and it stores your data in a document format that if you design it well and your application is of the type that's a sort of a traditional CRUD application, create, read, update, and delete, then you can pass that document almost straight through. And there's a lot of startups now that are focusing on backend as a service. There's Firebase. You can build Angular apps directly against it. There's mobile startups. There's Dream Factory. There's a ton of companies starting to build up in that space. I still don't really want to build my apps directly against the backend as a service, because then I got to pay them for every single hit. I prefer to put a server in place and at least implement some caching, because it's more cost effective. And their security is still a work in progress, but that can definitely be seen as sort of the future. And so your server is really simplified. It's authentication, it's integration, it's payment gateways, and so some domains will need this, such as retail. You're going to have a lot more on the server. In other areas, you're going to need it because you're going to be doing a lot of computation stuff, and you're going to need the libraries. You're going to have to tap into a different ecosystem. So one pain point in a full JavaScript stack, if you're using Node, which is a JavaScript server-side technology, is that it's really built to work with Mongo, and everyone's using Mongo with it. And so if you want to use an SQL database with Node, you're going to be in for a little pain compared to working with Python or Ruby or PHP. It's not as robust. But in other areas, for other libraries for building out your app, traditional web technology, it's fantastic. And the other areas like scientific computing, right? So Python has wonderful libraries for scientific computing. If I were to build a scientific computing backend, I would use Python. And I might still use Node as an API server and then plug into that. And so it's really becoming a service-oriented, API-centric sort of backend. But those are some of the reasons that I would move away from a full JavaScript stack. But that's what we're seeing, thin server computing. So we had the thin client era, and we're entering the thin server era. And it's because the most powerful computing platform that's available for building your apps is the browser. And so this is the new stack. It's not just Buzz. All three tiers have changed. The client has become browser-centric. And model view controller is a way of building complex apps. The server is a thin server REST event-driven application. And the databases are becoming document and web-centric. And so MongoDB is great for rapidly building your app. It makes it easier, but it's also great for scaling your app because it's web-friendly. It's not so good for doing complex transactions and certain types of reporting scenarios, but it really depends on the mix of your needs in your application. So 3 things have changed. This is the reaction a lot of people have. There's a lot of turmoil. Everybody I talk to in the Toronto tech community has an incredible amount of angst. They're trying to figure out, oh, should we be going with Rails? Should we be going with PHP? Should we be going with Node and JavaScript and Angular? Almost everybody has agreed that HTML5 is here. If you're building an application, if you consider HTML5 as a set of core capabilities across the major browsers, starting with, say, IE8, IE9 is a better fit. But if you go IE9 and beyond in the rest of the browsers, and you look at what your user base is, you're going to be hitting 93, 94, 95% of your audience can use these advanced HTML5 applications. And so you're left with that choice. Do we really sacrifice the user experience and the speed of web development to build an application that's going to support people who are still on IE8 because they're using Windows XP? For some cases, you do need to do that. So for instance, if the Chinese market's big for you, Windows XP is still the dominant operating system in China, and they still use IE mostly. But that could change rapidly with other browsers. People are starting to switch. I think like 3 years ago, I almost never ran into a business user who would use anything other than IE. And now I'd say at least half of them are using something else. And so a lot of people, who here has heard of the mean stack, just as a show of hands? So that means that you're quite involved with the JavaScript community. This is the new hot startup stack. This is what all the startups are looking at. They're looking at Rails, they're looking at this. And they're they might be looking at PHP depending on the space they're in. And this is MongoDB, that document-oriented database. It's Node and Express for the API server, and it's Angular on the front end. There's another aspect of this, and I'm going to touch upon this because we're talking about building Angular applications. And there's also the process stack that's emerging for front-end development. And so if you just start working with all these technologies, you're going to be pulling your hair out, trying to figure out how to get them all to work together. But there's a lot of amazing tools that have been coming out in the last 6 months. And I call that the process stack. So you've got your tech stack, and you've got your process stack. And there's a project called, with Node, you have NPM for module management. It's fantastic. It's probably the best module management tool, package management tool for any development tech out there. And then you have the Yeoman project, which is Yo, which is a generator. It's Grunt, which is a build tool like Make or Rake if you use, or Cake, I guess. And then Bower, which is a front-end dependency management tool, which is from Twitter, from the same guys who did Bootstrap, which has taken over a lot of the web. And with those tools, you can actually generate an Angular app using Yo. There's generators for all kinds of different technologies. And so you can rapidly get a best-of-breed application scaffolded with the right dependencies and have the dependency management via Bower and have the build management via Grunt and have that all set up in like 10 minutes. Then you have Git, which has become the dominant source control management tool, and continuous integration tools like Jenkins, and you have the whole test-driven development revolution, and that puts an amazing stack for building apps. So I'm just going to do a quick time check. All right. And so the 5 Ds of Angular, this is the way I like to describe what's sort of unique about it. It's declarative. The views are HTML. That's actually really interesting. It uses something called Angular directives, and we'll talk about that. That gets rid of a ton of boilerplate. You don't have to learn a templating language. You just learn the enhancements to HTML that you need to build your app. It's got a data flow architecture or a two-way data binding architecture where when you pull data from the server and you're holding it in your JavaScript code in the browser, you can bind it to the UI, which means that if someone types something in the user interface, it gets updated in your model. If you change your model because an event comes in from the server, a lot of people are using Socket.io to receive events. And so if you're listening messages in a chat stream and you have a message come in and you just push it into an array, it'll automatically appear on the screen. You don't have to do any code. You don't have to be doing any query selector. You don't have to be finding any section of the DOM and manipulating it. You just push it onto a simple array which has been bound to the document object model. It's quite mind-blowing. It's very dry, and that means don't repeat yourself. So when you consider the data flow, so you're not having to do the update and the read and all that kind of extra work, and you have the declarative definition of the views, then you also have two other things. You have pure JSON as the data model. You're not dealing with a complex object-oriented or other data model. It's pure, clean JSON. And most of your code is written in pure JavaScript. There's very few things that Angular enforces on you. It uses something called dependency injection to inject itself into your pretty simple, straightforward JavaScript code. And that's the dependency injection. And then finally, it's extremely designer-friendly. I mean, I've never seen a jQuery application, or I've never built one, that wouldn't get broke every time someone tried to modify the HTML. Because you have to do all kinds of sort of jumping through hoops to get your CSS, your cascading style sheets to work so that you can apply the jQuery rules and the application logic to your HTML. I mean, if you think about what an HTML5 application is, there's three components to it. There's the structure, which is HTML. There's the styling, which is CSS. And then there's the behavior, which is JavaScript. And those three have to work together to build your app. And if it's not clean HTML and CSS, then it's really hard to write the JavaScript. And they get too coupled, and changing your HTML or CSS will break your JavaScript. Changing your JavaScript will break your CSS or your HTML. And you've got this real mess when you're trying to get your app out the door, and every tweak in the CSS breaks something and vice versa. Angular doesn't have that. It's really beautiful the way it handles binding logic to the DOM. So Angular is different in 5 significant ways that compound in a profound way. And it can be a little challenging to learn initially, but once you have the light bulb sort of go off, it's amazing, and it's significantly different than other ways of building web apps. And so these are really, I think, the 5 commandments of AngularJS. This is maybe a little too abstract for now because we haven't really discussed it, but some of it should make sense just in the general technology world. HTML is the view. There is no other view technology, and you write Angular directives that are really like HTML6, right? So in HTML5, you have a list item, but you don't have a tab panel. And so you do all this ugly Bootstrap code to get your tabs going. I love Bootstrap, but doing sort of navigation bars and doing some of the form stuff, it gets really ugly really quick. You could create a tab panel, you could create a modal dialog directive, and you really simplify what you have to stick into the HTML. And you can build your app at a different level of abstraction. Communication is one way. That's more for when you're getting into it. You know, the DOM should really only be updated by directives. That's sort of the model. And then this really should go the other way. So services talk to controllers, controllers talk to directives, and those directives talk to the HTML. But we'll talk about that when we see some code. The controller does not manipulate the DOM, directives do that. And we'll see why that is the case and why that's so interesting. And then generally a single responsibility principle. You really want to have controllers, services, and directives do one thing and one thing well. That's a general code organization concept, but people are usually a little overwhelmed learning Angular, so they push everything into a single file, and it gets a little ugly. And so the core elements of Angular, so now we're going to actually get into it. So it's extended HTML. This is a complete Angular app here. There's actually one other file there, the invoice controller, but it doesn't do anything in this file. And so I'm going to show this in 2 other screens so you can read it. But the white stuff is HTML, and the blue stuff is where we have Angular stuff. And let's get that a little bigger. So I divided it into 2. So there's the header, and this is your standard HTML header. You got none of that doc type craziness from before. And you take your HTML and you do ng app equals app. And what that does is, the way Angular works is it reads your DOM and it looks for what it knows about. And it finds an ng app. And then it looks at that and it sees, oh, ng app equals app. And then it looks for a module that you've written. And it finds that module and it starts it up. And so there's a compile phase. That's how Angular does its magic. And the reason that Angular is running is because it got loaded here in the JavaScript. And so Angular in its core is one file. It's about 30K. It's pretty small when it's minified. There's some other things that you can add on that will make it a little bit bigger, but it's actually pretty lightweight. And so that's it. You load Angular into your page, and then you put ng app equals app, and app's the name of your module that it's going to look for, and it's up and running. This can be done anywhere. So if you have a PHP application, if you have a Ruby application, if you have a Python application, and you want to add something to a page, like a chat service or some interesting UI functionality, you can put this into your PHP template and you can load your Angular app on top of your existing application because it's just JavaScript. And if you're loading it here, it can work. It works with jQuery. It completely works fine with jQuery, so you're not going to have that conflict. And it's extremely smart about namespacing and uses good development techniques. And so now you can run Angular with pretty much any other JavaScript stuff you can think of. And then we get into the body, and there's a few more expressions. So these are directives, and there's Angular expressions as well. So ng controller is naming a controller, and this is registered with Angular as just a function. So this is a function that gets called, and it can interact with the DOM. And then there's other ones for doing things. So for instance, with your input type number, you can specify a pattern to do a restriction on it. You can specify a model. And a model is just a variable, a JavaScript variable that's on something called a scope. And so every Angular element has a scope, and that's where you put your data. And we'll see that in a couple of minutes. And so there's two models here, quantity and cost. And then you can do Angular expressions like here with those handlebars. And what that does is that executes that Angular expression. Now this is not JavaScript. This is actually the Angular expression language. And so you can't go crazy and do really bad things like you would have done in the past where people are putting alerts and stuffing business logic into the page. You can't get away with that with Angular because it's a little more restricted. And so there's that whole battle between unobtrusive JavaScript where people removed everything from HTML. And I think that was absolutely awful in the end because you go look at an HTML page and you've got no idea what's going on. And you're trying to fix your app and you've got to go searching through the selector logic to find out where the selectors are. But then you go with too much JavaScript and that's even worse. There's a nice balance. And Angular does that exceptionally well with this binding logic. And what this means is because you're binding to these specific parts of the DOM, you don't have to do query selections. It's implicit. And so if you think about that div, ng controller equals invoice control, since you've declared and loaded that controller, that block of application logic on that div, Angular knows where that div is. It knows it's attached to that div. And it mediates that knowledge with something called a scope. And if anyone here is a programmer, there's the concept of scope. You have functional scope, variables are in scope, out of scope. Well, this is like scope for DOM elements. So your DOM is in or out of scope, and it's limited based upon Angular creating and managing these scopes, so you can't cheat. And so with scope in programming languages, the thing that helps you get away from is global variables. And so you can track down bugs and you don't make bad mistakes. The same thing here. Your scope is controlled by Angular, and we'll see a scope model in a little bit. The final thing there is currency, and that's called a filter. So we have here a bunch of directives. These are all built-in directives with Angular. We haven't written any, but you can write your own. So anything you can conceive of, you can pretty much do. And then there's the model, which is on the scope for that section. And then there's filters, which allow you to just tweak your output. And so that's going to take the quantity times cost, and it's going to display it in a currency format. And so without having to do any extra work, you've got your total and you're showing it nicely in the application. And so there are sort of formatting sort of helpers where it's easy enough and makes enough sense to do it here versus in your logic, controller logic. So the first thing that we were talking about was ng app. This bootstraps the application. And so your application has included AngularJS. It has ng app equals app. And this attaches that application to this node in the DOM. You can actually have multiple apps. So you could build 5 little Angular apps and have them do different little things, almost like smart panels in an interactive display. And that could work well for certain types of applications because they're completely decoupled. Different teams can work on them, and you can load them up and tack them on to different parts of the DOM. You can also leave this out, and jQuery has this thing where you go on document ready, and you know it's started up, and then you start calling things. You can also bootstrap Angular using an imperative thing on a document ready function call. this handles it automatically. And this is the normal case, unless you have something really weird going on where you absolutely don't want Angular starting up right away because you have to use some other library, like a jQuery library, to get some data first before you're ready to start up your Angular app, because there might be a dependency there. Normally, I've never actually not done that. I've never used that. I've always gone this way. So one very small, fairly small JavaScript, 30K. ng controller, this is really getting into the heart of Angular. So you have a DOM, which is your view. Your view is HTML. You have the directives, which make things happen. And this directive links JavaScript code to it. And so with this, you could call inside invoice controller, you can make that query to the server to get your list of invoices. That's where that logic would be. So this has got the list of invoices and it sticks it on the scope. And the scope is tied to this div. And so all you have to do is put in invoices, the variable name, inside those handlebars, and it displays here. You don't have to do any query selection at all. Again, the ng model, so that's what I was talking about, like invoices. Maybe it pulled the invoices and it rolled up a quantity. That quantity is on the scope. The controller put it on the scope, so the DOM can, or the HTML view can access it. And again, because it's bound to that one small section of the document object model, you don't have to do anything funky to really resolve where that's going. You can just make that call using ng model. And the two-way data binding. So we were talking about that. So we have that invoice controller. It's pulling data. We could have put the list of invoices on here. In this section here, it's taking some inputs from that ng model on the let me go back quickly. So here it's an input type number, model equals cost. This actually doesn't even have to be in the controller. This application we're looking at runs without that controller because the controller didn't come into play. We're inputting the cost here. We're typing it in. And we're inputting the quantity here because it's an input. So you type in quantity, ng model stuffs it into the scope. Number, ng model, you type it in the input, it gets stuffed into the scope. And because we're within that one controller, that's one constrained scope, and then the Angular expression can multiply the two together. It's pulling it from the scope again, and then it filters it through an Angular filter. And scope is really the magic going on. And when you use a directive, directives, when you write them, you specify whether it's going to inherit scope from its parent, whether it's going to create its own scope, whether it's going to have an isolated scope. And so that's one of the challenging areas when you get into developing Angular in directives, is if you have to do some funky scope stuff. But for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. And so here we have a document object model, a typical HTML page. So you have HTML and you have a bunch of divs, and in one div you have a list. Each one of those directives generates its own scope. But scopes are hierarchical. And so what that means, if you put a title on root scope, and this $ means it's an Angular service. If you put a title on there, and then here you do that sort of handlebars and you do title, it will show up. Because this scope inherits from this scope, inherits from this scope, inherits from this scope. And that's one of the fun things to get your head around when you get your first few applications going, is you run into some bugs trying to figure out the scope. And my recommendation to anyone who's having trouble understanding how scopes work is now take the time finally to understand how JavaScript object prototypes work, because that's all this is. It's using the JavaScript object prototype function. How many people here know JavaScript before I kill a few people in the audience? So most people. So because I don't want to go on about JavaScript, because this is also useful, I think, for HTML developers, and it's an esoteric subject. But basically, quickly, to save you some pain, is that if this has a title and you go to read title from here, you'll read it and it'll show up. If you go to write the title, you might assume that it's updating this title. But JavaScript inheritance, prototype inheritance, is read-only. And so as soon as you write here, you're shadowing it. It's got its own title, and you're never going to see this title again in your application logic. And so that's what happens, is people put in a nice little sort of UI here. They use those handlebars, and they do title, and title appears. And then they put an input box, and they want to do a new title. They're doing their title update, and they type it, and they save it. And it never gets saved to the database because this is being saved. This is where the logic is. And so that's one of the big gotchas in Angular development. And this is JavaScript, pure JavaScript object prototype inheritance. So if you understand that, you can work your way through this. The other thing is ng controllers. There's only one here, But if you have multiple ng controllers nested in your DOM, they also inherit from each other because they're all being mediated by their scopes. And so this controller is sticking data on this scope, and this, if you had a controller down here, it would be putting it on its scope. And so you can call functions and you can access data from higher up controllers because they also inherit through that scope sort of relationship. And you can run into some issues with that as well, but it's also a lot of the power in working with the application. So these are some of the AngularJS elements that we've been talking about. There's directives, which is how you extend HTML5. You can think of Angular in some respects as how to make your own HTML6. You don't like something in HTML5, you go ahead and you make your own directives. Angular expressions is how you bind your business logic into Angular. It's just enough JavaScript that you can do what you need to do the binding, and not enough that you can basically hang yourself by stuffing your whole app into the HTML. The controllers are where you put your main logic for mediating between your data and your view. This is model view controller, so if you've ever worked with that, it's the same sort of architecture pattern. Services are basically, like most services, they encapsulate something reusable. So one of the key elements of software development is don't repeat yourself. And if you have a controller that needs to access user information and you query for the user in that controller, and then you have another controller that needs the same logic, and you start cut and paste that code, that's a no-no, right? That's going to cause you trouble in the future. You're going to have to debug it. You're actually wasting time because you're duplicating the effort. So you take that common code and you put it in a service, and that service can then be injected into as many controllers as you want. Filters, that was what we saw, the currency thing. And then views, and that's, there aren't any, right? Really, we already covered that because it's HTML with directives and Angular expressions. And then you're going to see a whole bunch of Angular sort of services, scope, HTTP, resource. Some of these will operate similar to jQuery if you're familiar with jQuery, like the HTTP service. Angular is very, very oriented on just JavaScript, JSON, JavaScript object notation, and web standards. And so if you're using a RESTful API that's serving up JSON, you're going to be in really good shape. You can build your app really fast. If you're going against a non-RESTful API that's serving you up XML, it's not going to be as much fun. I don't know, you might want to throw up a Node API server then. So, building your first AngularJS app. When I talk about AngularJS, like I just said, you want a RESTful API server. The hot startup stack is Node.js plus Express plus MongoDB. But if it's a RESTful API server that's serving up meaningful JSON that fits your application domain, you're good, right? It doesn't matter what's behind that API, and that's the whole thing, right? Everything's being modeled as resources, and those resources are being described well in JSON, and it's meaningful, and it's exactly what you're looking for. If you're doing a project management application, when you say, give me the project, you have JSON, which has the project, and it has all the tasks, and it's all in a nice document, and you can just do project.task and access all your tasks, and you're happy. And you could swap that out and do it with anything. So Angular, I was talking about that sort of stack, the process stack. So there's an Angular generator, and if you install Node, that opens up a whole world of development goodness, even if you don't use Angular. And even if you don't use Node, you can use that to install Grunt, you can use that to install Yeoman, and now you can do stuff like generate your app. So there's a really cool mobile, HTML5 mobile app generator that just came out a month ago. And if you want to build a mobile app using that tech stack, you can just install Node, install Yeoman, install that generator, and then you do Yo, and it would be whatever mobile app. And it's going to scaffold out that app. And even if you never use Node for anything else, it's sort of a necessary technology now for front-end web development, if just for using some of the cool tools. And so I ran it, and here's a listing of it, and a lot of this, I guess I can, let's see. No, I got no mouse. So what we have here is, it's not the best layout, but we have a license, a README, an app.js. That's the main application for Angular that is going to run your sort of stuff. And then you have views, which are HTML fragments that you can bring into an HTML page. And actually, what am I looking at there? Nope, sorry, I went sorry, I'm in the wrong section. That's on the next page. Forget what I just said. And so this is your Node app, and then here you're doing Yo Angular, and this is generating the Angular app. So I'm generating the Angular app on this screenshot in the Node application directory. So I got my API server there, but that's not what we're talking about today. And you run it, and it generates the code. Once you've scaffolded your Angular app, you can type grunt server, because like I mentioned, Yeoman is the Yo generator. It is grunt for build automation, and it's Bower. And you do grunt server, and this will fire up a very lightweight web server, and it will pop up your web browser, and it'll show you the simple app that they put there so you know that it's all working. I use Sublime Text. The default scaffolded app uses live reload, and I have live reload in Sublime Text, and they conflict, so I usually have to change my port. I put that in there because I was using this in a class. And then you can type grunt tests, and you're actually running unit tests already. It scaffolds some very basic unit tests that aren't particularly real, but at least you run it, you can see the results of the unit tests, and then you can just start that practice. And if you remember to keep running this, you'll remember to keep reminding yourself to write unit tests. It's got you all set up with Karma. It's the really cool test runner. Just a quick aside on that. One of the challenges with doing unit testing in HTML and JavaScript is you have to do it in the browser. And so there's like Jasmine, and you have to include it into the browser, and you got to load the browser, and you've got to do all that work. Karma is a test runner that does it for you. And so you do it from the command line. It's going to launch multiple browsers if you want. It's going to do the testing, and it's going to give you the results all from the command line. It's almost like it's running like on the server. The Angular stack that I'm fond of is AngularJS, Bootstrap. We've moved to Bootstrap 3 recently, and it's pretty cool. Angular UI, which is a whole collection of user interface stuff for Angular to sort of speed that up. There's a Bootstrap component there. It's on Bootstrap 2, but they're about 75% of the way to Bootstrap 3. That also in that project they have Angular Grid, which is a cool table grid that's pretty easy to use. I'm a big fan of _JS. And so one thing with JavaScript is JavaScript's very much a functional programming language. JavaScript is closer to Lisp than it is to Java, which is confusing. I was introduced at a conference a few weeks ago as a Java expert, and I almost started crying. But I spent a lot of time doing Java, so I do know it, but it's unfortunate because there's absolutely no similarities except they share a C syntax. And so, JavaScript is closer to Lisp, really, because it has higher order functions, first order functions, which means you build your application using functions. And it's a different programming model because object orientation has been such a fad over the last couple of decades, and it's a very cool technology for building certain types of apps. But for other apps, this is a lot faster using a functional paradigm like in JavaScript. And underscore just gives a lot of good functional goodness to JavaScript. And there's a really cool book called Functional JavaScript by Michael Fogus. He's with the Clojure Lisp community, and that came out in June. And it's based on underscore. And it lets you do stuff that normally you'd be just reading about in books on Haskell and Clojure and Scala. I have a picture of it later in the slide deck. D3 is just an absolutely, who here has used D3 for anything? I mean, it's a fantastic library for doing, it's open source, and you can do all kinds of really cool, pretty charts. We use that in all our sort of projects. And then, the stack. So Node, Express, and Mongo, that's the M, E, and N to go with Angular's A in the mean stack. Right here. So these, to me, if you're going to be doing Angular work, I do recommend functional JavaScript. It is a hard read if you don't know underscore. So I'd recommend spending like a half day with underscore first. And then the book, it just shows really cool ways of dealing with certain problems that are really effective. And then mastering web application development with AngularJS. This came out a month ago, and it's far and away the best AngularJS book on the market. It's written by two guys who know it inside and out. They did the Angular Seed project, and they wrote a great book. It covers a lot of the real world sort of things, like how you would approach certain problems, some of the edge cases, some of the problems, some of the things you have to work around. It's got really good examples. The examples are sort of comprehensive in areas that a lot of other books skip over. They do a whole chapter on directives that's done test-driven development, which is fantastic. It's a little awkward because they start off writing the test before they tell you how to write a directive. But once you get to that, it's really cool. It's just, I can't give the book enough praise. The second half of the book is a little more uneven than the first half. I think that happens in the editing process and getting to market. But I actually have every single AngularJS book on the market because there's only 6. And that's the best one. And I'm not buying any more. So if you're writing one, I'm not buying it. I got too many. And this is, okay. Oh yeah, that's it. So that means I'm going to do a demo. So sorry, I got sort of confused on where I was in my slides. And I'll do a quick time check. Oh, we're doing good, right?
Yep.
20. So 20 minutes?
20.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. How about we all just raise our hands quickly to get ourselves some energy, and then we'll get back into just as he's switching over to the different application that he needs to use. Stretch, arms up, maybe stand up, get a good hopscotch, whatnot. Give you guys some energy. I need it. All the guys in the room, suck it in. Cool. Awesome. So make sure at the back you guys can read this. If you can't read this, please voice your opinion that you can't read it if it's not big enough.
All right. So I'm at a command prompt. I have Node installed. I have the Angular generator installed. I have Yeoman installed. If I wanted to install Yeoman, I always say Yeoman, it's Yeoman. If I didn't have it installed, I would do npm install -g, that means global. So with Node, there's 2 types of packages. One's global, that usually means it has a command line tool, like it's a generator or does something on the command line. And then there's locals, which gets installed into your local directory, and there's no -g. And those are the ones you're including in your app. And so I do this, yo, and then I can actually stick a bunch of stuff on the line. These are all, so I could do generator Angular, and I could do grunt command line interface. Grunt is split into a command line interface and a module that gets installed into your project. And Bower. And if I hit enter now, it would install all this goodness. So I've just installed Node, which takes about 5 minutes. This is going to install the rest, and then I'm up and ready to go. And I can do cool stuff like yo Angular, if I spell it right. And this is going to ask a few questions. Would I like to include Twitter Bootstrap? Thank you, yes. Am I going to use Compass? I am not. And then I mentioned that Angular is about 30K and it's a good small size. Here's 3 things that you can add: Angular Resource, Angular Cookies, and Angular Sanitize, and this is going to make it bigger. Resource is a way for dealing with RESTful APIs. It's fantastic. It's improving a lot in Angular 1.2, which is hopefully out in the next week. Angular Cookies is for cookie management, important for doing session type stuff and whatnot. And then Angular Sanitize is if you're doing an application where you're taking people's inputs and you want to sanitize it to make sure they're not doing SQL injection attacks and stuff like that. What it does is it installs it, and then it actually automatically runs npm install, which is going to install the Node packages that its toolchain uses. These are all on the development side. So it's going to install the grunt, it's going to install karma, and that kind of stuff, so we can run our unit tests and things you do on the command line. There's no npm dependencies for Angular because npm is a Node package manager running on the server side. Bower installs the packages that you're going to be using in the browser. So your D3, your Angular, your jQuery, and that kind of stuff. Underscore. Actually, underscore you can install in both places. You can use underscore on the server side, so you could install it with npm, and you could install it with Bower to use it on the client side, and that's what I do. And then once that's installed, you can do all that kind of stuff. And so that's finished essentially, and if I view the package JSON, this is what's installed, and it's a little crazy, but it's nice and modular. So grunt, we installed the command line interface that would, with the command I mentioned. Dependencies, that's server side, so you can see that's empty. And then here's grunt and all the sort of grunt stuff it's using in its tool chain. So it installs stuff. It doesn't ask you a lot of questions. You can strip out some of this stuff. If you're not using CoffeeScript, you can get rid of that. If you're not using Compass, you can get rid of that. And some of this is minification. So if you're deploying to production, you usually want to uglify and minify your JavaScript and your CSS. And so you're seeing that there. If you're doing JavaScript stuff and you're not doing JS hint, please do. It's wonderful. It actually will capture bugs that would burn you otherwise. It is coding conventions in a automated tool. So it's a fork of JSLint, and it looks at your JavaScript and it tells you what rules you've broken according to the rules that you've configured. It's very, very good. And all the way through here, this is a watch tool. So when you're changing files, if you want the browser to reload automatically, minification, there's a lot of stuff, but a lot of it's pretty good stuff. And there's even asset tagging. So one of the things that when you're deploying a massive app and you're changing your assets, sometimes they just never seem to show up, right? Because of caching and browsers and stuff like that. When you run the build process, it's going to tag them with numbers. And so it's going to minify your JS and put it all in one file with no white space, and it's going to take your images and prefix them with numbers. And so that when you want to do a new push to production, all the caches are not going to see those old images anymore. They're going to see new image names, and they're going to load them up nice, and you're not going to pull your hair out trying to figure out e-tags and caches and headers and good God knows what else. And that's pretty much it. That's the server-side stuff, and that's mostly the build chain. And then there is Bower. And so these are the Bower dependencies, Angular, JSON 3. A lot of these, I would say, are thanks to IE. So you need to do shims and whatnot. So you want to run on IE7 and IE8. So JSON 3, jQuery, ES5 shim. And then the other ones are Angular. So this is Angular. Right? That's the main Angular file. Angular can use jQuery or not. And so it has its own version of jQuery called JQLite. And what that is it's a very lightweight query selector. So you can make all those nice query selectors, but without any of the other stuff from jQuery. If you include jQuery before Angular in your HTML file, Angular will default to using jQuery. And so that's actually done most of the time because you might use one or two jQuery plugins or some elements. And there's also something with Angular where its JQLite is not as good for loading certain things. It's a situation where you're loading a template view and you have a reference to another file. It won't load it, whereas jQuery will. So I don't remember the exact scenario, but that's another reason for using it. And then the development dependencies. So most of these are client-side, and it actually does two development dependencies, and this is for unit testing. So scenario runner and mocks. It's got a great set of mocks, and so you can easily mock your HTTP backend. And what that allows you to do is when you're testing your controllers and your services that are getting data from the server, it's like 3 lines of code, and you can have it going to your mock, and you can test quickly without actually having to run against the live server. And I'm going to go to a folder that I created before. And here's our set of files. And so we've got our app, we have our grunt file, node modules, and I'm going to do grunt serve. Oh. And so this is going to go through the tool chain and pop this up. So hello, hello, you now have HTML5 boilerplate, AngularJS, and Karma. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually modify this. And so this is one view, and there's no routes, there's no controllers. And so let's go back to our section here. I'm going to close this for a sec. And I'm going to go back to Yo Angular. And I'm going to do Yo Angular service, and I'm going to make a television service. And so what this does is it just creates the television JavaScript file. So that's our service. That's where we have common logic that's shared among controllers. And it creates a very simple test spec. And now let's try grunt test and see what happens. I don't have Karma installed. So, and this would run through the tests, and then it would show the result. I could bring this up in another section, but anyway, it's not really that informative. It would run the tests. I'll show you the tests themselves, and it would show you that they currently pass. I'm going to also do Yo Angular route, and I'm going to call this favorites. Stay Canadian. And so what this is going to do is this is going to create a controller. So a route is not actually something that is specifically a thing in Angular. It's a bunch of things. It's a view, it's a controller, and it's a route definition that links the two together. And so it's created those, it's created the controller, it's created the test spec, it's created the view, and it's actually loaded all these up into my index.html. And so now if I go into that, I'm going to open up the app folder, and let me see if I maybe go full screen. And so we can go in here, and this looks like a typical web page. So we've got our index.html. The default generator uses the HTML5 boilerplate, so you got a lot of goodness there to work across browsers. Most of this crap is because of IE. For Angular stuff, so here's our ng app that we've been talking about. So if we're looking through what's Angular, well, let's go cruising through here. So that's our first bit of Angular. That's our module. So that's bootstrapping the application. Then this here is this is Bootstrap 3, so bootstrapping not as in Bootstrap, different type of bootstrap. And then here's our ng view. This is Angular again. And ng view is something that can be swapped. You can swap in fragments of HTML, so little subviews. And then they put in the Google Analytics stuff. And going down further, you see here it's loaded jQuery first from Bower Components. And so later on, if I want to update the versions I'm using, I can update Bower JSON and run Bower install again, or Bower update. And then this put all this stuff in. You know, it's a relatively new product. I didn't ask for Sass. If you remember, I said no, and it still gave me all this stuff. That's okay. I think the newer one doesn't do that. And then here's the actual Angular stuff: resource, cookies, and sanitize. And then here's my app. My app code that I'm going to modify. This is sort of the bootstrapping code. My controller, my service, and my second controller. Oh, so it came with one controller by default called the main controller. And so let's go look at our app again. Actually, before I do that though, because you will look the same if I don't change anything, here's the views. We've added favorites, and it says this is the favorites view. And let me clear this out, and I'm going to do h1 my favorite TV characters. Yeah, Matthew knows where this is going. So, so I got, I'm going to do a UL, and I'm going to do a list, and I'm going to do an ng repeat equals, and I'm going to do character in characters. And let's do then this funky Angular expression. And we'll do character name. And we'll close it. And we'll close this. And so let's see what we got here. So we've got a simple HTML page, and we put in one directive and one Angular expression. And our directive is calling ng repeat. And what that does is that iterates through a data structure. In this case, it could be a simple array. Angular loves plain JavaScript. And it duplicates the DOM element. So it's going to copy this. So if I have 200 characters, it's going to do 200 list items. There's going to be two scopes here. There's going to be the scope for the view that covers the whole page, and then there's going to be one scope per list item. And the reason that's helpful is that sometimes if you want to update that list item, you can put the logic on that's going to deal with it in that particular scope, and you don't have to do any kind of query selector again. So let's have a look at what this looks like, because I haven't touched anything, and we don't have a place for characters to come in from yet, so it may blow up a little bit. And let's see, did I leave it running? No, I don't think so. We'll go grunt server. All right, so this is our main one, and so let's go look at favorites. Nothing. Let's go look at the command line. So big first tip, Angular development. If something's not working, go look at the console, because you're probably spewing sort of errors here, and you can quickly find out what the problem is. Second tip, make sure you have Batarang installed. And what that does is it allows you to look at your scopes. And so if you got something really crazy going on, you can look at them and you can see the JSON on there. So here's this scope, and you can see this has stuff on it, but we're not displaying it. So this was what you saw from that generator. It's still in the controller. And so you can see that we're on this scope and there's actually stuff, but we can't see it. So that means that my Angular expression's not looking at it. And we have the one root scope, which we didn't put anything on. So nothing's showing up here. And if you're seeing, you're going, where is this? You can click here, and it's going to take you right into your source and show you where it's pulling the scope from. And once you've done that, you can actually go back into your console and type scope.
Zoom in on that, Command plus.
Oh. There we go. Scope. So there's that. So as a good trick, when you're doing debugging, people often do console log. That doesn't work so well for objects. What you're seeing here with that child scope, how you can look into it, you can put that in your own code, and if you do console.dir, it's going to give you the same kind of output. And so with Angular, you're dealing with lots of JSON, lots of data structures. And so if you do console.dir scope, which of course is already there, but it's going to give you this child thing. And if we do console log scope, this one does here anyway, but if you do dir, you'll get deeper into your structure and you can browse through it. So here it works anyway. And so you can come in here, and here you can see some of the, if it's a $sign, it's an Angular service that you're allowed to know about and use. If it's $2 signs, it's private and you're not supposed to mess with it, just so you know. So let's clear that out of the way. And bring up Sublime Text again. So let's see what we got, character and characters. Let's look at the controller. So we go to scripts, and we go to controller, and we go to favorites, and it gave us this default stuff. And we're going to do, and get rid of that. And again, plain JavaScript. And it's all JSON everywhere. So I am, as a programmer, I am a big Doctor Who fan. And when I was 5 years old, I was a huge Polkaroo fan, and I couldn't believe how stupid the adults were because they could never see him. Yeah, so I was there screaming at the TV with my mom looking at me like I was really strange, because the one person never got to see him. And actually, that's any real Doctor Who fans going, oh, dude. So you write it like that. So, and there's a few more, but that's good enough for now. So this is a controller. So it's Angular has modules, and you define a module. So you saw our TVO app module that we were loading. You can have multiple modules to divide up your app into different sort of sections. And once you have a module defined, you can define controllers and services and things on it. Now you could do this all in one file. So if I want to do a second controller, I could use this kind of thing. And it's responsive. It's fluid, I should say. It's a fluid API. So a definition of a controller returns the module back. And so you can just chain these like this. It's a common little JavaScript thing. And I could do more there. But the general rule is one file per thing, because it's a lot easier to manage. And so I'll leave that like that. And let's go back here, and let's load it up. Oh. Let's run it. And let's go back to favorites. And there we go. And so that ng repeat has gone through this, and it's updated the two of them. Now I mentioned two-way data binding, didn't I? So let's do that. So let's go back here. And let's go, oh, and I did mention also that, hey, what if we want to use this in multiple sort of sections, right? That might be bad. So let's do that first. So I'm going to take the characters, and I'm going to put it into a sort of database service, and I'm going to make a call to it. And then I'm going to go over, actually, what did I call my service? Television. Television characters. And I'm going to go over to the television characters. And people who have done Angular are going, oh, wait a second, dude, it's not going to work. But I'm going to go back. All right, so we got our characters here. And we are going to do, what do we got? We got a service. And so we're going to do return characters function. So we had a characters function. We come back to here, and we're going to return characters. And we should be good. So we've just moved the sort of the array over here. So you can see here our service is called television. It's also being put on the same module. And we're returning this. So let's go back over to the favorites.js. And because everything in Angular uses dependency injection, to use a service in a controller, you put the name here. And what Angular does, I mentioned before, when it's building that DOM, it goes through and it finds all the Angular directives and it does that compile stage. It does sort of the same thing with your code. It goes through and it knows that when you're defining a character and that signature, what you're passing in there, that you're actually mentioning modules that you want to include, and it reads those and it injects them in. And so this is almost all just pure JavaScript that we're sticking on a module. You could actually write a controller without any of this, and you could stick it on, I could write a controller like this. I could use the global window object, and I could do, favorites, and function, and inject the scope. And I could do that, and it would still work. But I wouldn't be getting the sort of the module stuff, and I'd be polluting the global namespace. So we don't do that. But it's sort of an interesting reflection of how Angular works. And so we're injecting television, and because that's a capital, we put that here. And so now our service has been refactored a little bit, and we have a service, and we're passing that in. Let's see if we're running. And there we go. And so now we move that logic into a service. We've injected into our controller, and now we can inject that. If I want to make another service, I can come into my Angular code, and if I want to say go back to the main service here, and I want to use that, I want to put that list of television characters here, television, and let's get rid of this. And we'll call it, so we're calling the service, and I got a little thing going on here with my server crashing. I made a little error there because I just put in the characters and I'm not calling the name. So if you remember, in my code I did character.name, and here it's just dumping out the whole thing. I'm passing in actually a JSON object. So I could go into the view now and do .name and it would show that. And so that's sort of a very effective way of reusing information. So we'll go back to favorites, and I promise to show two-way data binding. And I will be concluding pretty much with that, so bear with me for a sec. And so we're going to go over to our favorites, and we have this list here, and let's say, okay, that's really cool, but we want to update it. And so we do input, and we do ng model equals character name. Let me drop this down so we can see it a little better.
Misspelled character.
Thank you. Oh, there we go. And I'm missing a little brace there, a bracket, and that should work. It can work without it. It'll default, I think. So let's give that a shot. There we go. So these are bound onto the scope. And so as soon as I change it anywhere, I've used ng model to put the character name into the input. And so when I change it, it's changing it on the scope. And we were displaying from the scope there. And so as I change that, it updates there. And so now if I want to save this to the database, I come back to here. And so let's do a button for good. And we can do a button, and we can say save. Thank you. And we can do ng click, save character. And so you remember I was talking about scope, right? And how scope was really, really cool. When I type save character here, I could have another character and characters in another section, but this is in the ng repeat scope, so it knows exactly which character I'm referencing. And so again, I'm not doing a search on like an li element and grabbing that. And so I got character name, I got the click, I go do the save character, make sure I got everything that I need, like that. Yep. Save character, so we're good there. And so let's go over to favorites. And then the way you do this is you attach that function to the scope, the magic scope. So you do scope, save, function, character, and let's do a console log. And we do character, and we do plus character. And if I wanted to actually save that to the database, I would inject and actually in 5 minutes I could have it wired up to Mongo. But I won't do that because I'm running a little late. And so I'll come here, and but basically I would inject the HTTP service and do HTTP post and specify the URL, which I don't have, but it would be characters, and that would be set up to receive a post. And then you can put in a callback function or whatever to receive that it actually worked. So let's get rid of that, and I'm going to save this before I get yanked off by the cane. Grunt server. I'm probably pushing my luck. Hasn't blown up yet. So far it's going good. And let's see what we got. There we go. And I was talking about, that whole thing about log versus dir, right? So if I have an error, I'm looking at that, I'm going, ouch, I don't know what that is. And so if I come back here and I change this to a dir, then I got to actually put the object there because it'll look at the string and not work if I do that. And I'll save that. And that always seems to blow up for some reason today. That's never happened before, so I think I updated to Mavericks yesterday. So and see, now I got this cool object. So now that's a big thing. A lot of people don't know that, and that can really ease your sort of debugging. And so there's pretty much a fairly complete Angular app. I ran the generator. I showed you services, dependency injection. I didn't show you a test. So let me show you a quick test, and then I can claim completeness. And so it comes in here, it creates a test directory, and it's generated one for us, and controllers, and favorites. And this is a fairly simple test. You wouldn't really run this. It just is checking to see that your data structure is there. This uses the Jasmine format. It's behavior-driven development type testing. You can also, here where you see controller and root scope, inject the HTTP backend and start mocking it at the backend. And so that is the end of my Angular demo. So hopefully that was informative and showed you how Angular works and some of the main concepts. I have, if Matthew will humor me for just one more minute, 30 seconds. So I mentioned the two books. I highly recommend both of these. My two favorite books of the year.
We actually also recommend the functional JavaScript at least. I gave one out at either the last one or the time before. I definitely recommend if you guys want to get into it, check those out. Or at least I know the one.
By the way, if you're wondering how I'm typing this and sort of doing it, I just finished teaching a 2-day course, so I've been doing this constantly for the last 2 days. And so otherwise, if I did this a week from now, I'd probably make more mistakes. So we're heavily involved, as Matthew was talking to the community. So we run the AngularJS meetup. We started a PhoneGap meetup. That's almost as hot as Angular. If you go to meetup.com and you type angularjs.meetup.com or phonegap.meetup.com or your favorite technology.meetup.com, it'll show you the ranking in the world, how those sort of fit. And the AngularJS meetup in just 3 months in Toronto is 6th, which is a real good testament to the Toronto community and how forward-thinking it is. And the PhoneGap meetup globally is about as big as Angular. And the Toronto one after a month is about 170 people. So that one's going pretty well. I was talking about Stack Angst. So we're putting together just a sort of friendly conference later this year called sort of Stack Fest for people who have to make technology decisions for startups and businesses, and to bring in some leaders and talk about and share information on Stack strategy. And if you are interested in learning more, next Wednesday, October the 30th, we are doing AngularJS in data. We're going to have a talk on MongoDB, just sort of from the ground up, and talk about REST and APIs and just the whole managing of data. We'll probably do a section on promises and HTTP for doing asynchronous data. PhoneGap meetup is going to be November 27th, the next one. It's going to be our second one, and it's, that's an old title. Sorry, that was the first one. And so that one's going to be a PhoneGap app showcase. Then there's going to be an Advanced JS conference.
Which we have a ticketing away for, so think of a question for that to ask.
Okay, like a JavaScript question.
An AngularJS question.
An AngularJS question. Okay. And we're going to be speaking there, actually. So if you're interested in continuous deployment, we're talking about that sort of workflow. And so I showed you the tools and the grunt and the bower, so I'll be doing a talk there. We run training. I just finished that, which is why my memory's good on all the commands. We'll be doing another one in December or January. And then I mentioned the CTO conference. Related resources for this talk and building the mean stack, configuring it for development, getting all those tools in place. We're going to be releasing an ebook in a week or 2 or 3. It's with our designer right now. And sort of take the course and put that into an ebook as well. And so if anyone's interested in those, we do have a mailing list, or you can join the AngularJS meetup and get that information there. Yeah, that's sort of it. And AngularJS question?
Yes.